If you would pull out your Bibles, turn to Esther chapter 2. We're going to continue our study of Esther. The book of Esther is a historical narrative. Now, what does that mean? Any thoughts?
It's a real story.
Okay, it's a real story. It's historical, and it's just okay, and it's written like a book, so it kind of flows like it's a narrative. We looked at chapter 1. Let's read chapter 2 together, and I'm going to have you guys read that. So maybe if you'll read out loud, if someone would take verses 1 through 7 of chapter 2. Okay. So there's 10 chapters in Esther, and again, it's a historical narrative. It's a true story. It flows like a story. It doesn't have a whole lot of detail in it. Another observation about it is that the name of God is not mentioned in the book. It's one of the few books, in fact, there's only 2 books in the whole Bible that don't have God's name mentioned in it. It'd be Esther, and what else? I know it's definitely not mentioned in this one. And so there was a lot of discussion in the early church fathers and those who were preparing the canon. Should this book be included in the Bible? And why is it included in the Bible? Okay, it shows God's hand in Israel. It also shows the beginning of the Feast of Purim, and that feast is still practiced today, the Feast of Purim, which is practiced in March. Do you know what that feast celebrates?
Casting lots.
What?
Lots.
Casting lots, as far as Hanan was casting lots for when they would, he was proposing to exile or to terminate all of the children of Israel, or the Israelites or the Jews there. So it celebrates Esther's heroic role in saving God's people. And of course, Purim means lots, and Haman was casting lots to determine the day when they'd have the genocide then of all of the Jews, and so that's what they celebrate. Now, if you look at chapter 2, as far as it begins, where it picks off in chapter 1, and King Ahasuerus, is how I would say that. In verse 1 it says, "After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what he had done, and what decree had been and what had been decreed against her." Do you know how many years have passed since chapter 1 to chapter 2? Getting close.
It talks about later it's in his 7th reign, and it's a couple of years, 12 years for the cosmetics and whatnot, and about a year for choosing. So
It's probably 3, but definitely 2 to 3 years past. So if you're thinking that, it's just immediately, in fact, what has happened historically is that he's gone into battle and he's tried to defeat the Greeks. He lost that battle. He's already come back home, and as he's come back home, he's disgusted, for one thing, that he got whooped in that battle against Greece. And of course, he's wanting to come home back to the palace, into the loving arms of his wife. And he remembers, oh, wait just a minute, she's not even going to be here. And so some of the commentators and Bible scholars would say there's a sense of disappointment that he has as he remembers that. Now, an interesting thing as you think about this king, as far as Cindy and I were talking about this and kind of reading over this whole deal, and she's like, "Man, he is really pretty much a pig, isn't he? As far as he's not a very nice guy." And of course, one of the things that you make then is that then in chapter 2, as far as you kind of see his character when the king's attendants who had served him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king." So it was like, it seems like he couldn't make up his mind all the time, and he relied on a lot of others as far as to help him, not only here, but even back in chapter 1, as far as you get this sense that he's not somebody who just openly makes his choices there. So definitely we see that. So it's good to remember that it's 2 or 3 years have transpired from chapter 1 to chapter 3. By the time he selects Esther, it's going to be a good 4 years before he even decides to make that. So it's different commentaries will talk about how many years have passed, but I would say you're definitely looking at 2 to 3 before that, and it's going to be 4 years before he actually selects Esther at that point. Why were the eunuchs given the role of supervising the women?
Because they couldn't cause too much trouble physically.
Yeah, they'd been castrated, so they couldn't cause that, and so they had them. And as far as it's pretty obvious here, of course, they're in a non-Christian or non-Jewish country here, living as exiles. And so this king has a harem, and the harems, they lived in a whole separate part of the household. Or in this case, the palace that was reserved for them to live in that time, because in that culture, of course, the kings had multiple wives. They had harems that they would go to, and so these separate parts of the house were reserved for these second-class wives, if you would, concubines and female servants. It literally says that the king appointed officers in all the provinces of his kingdom. How many provinces did he have? 127. 127 provinces. So literally, as far as there would be 25 million women in those provinces that they could have selected from. Now, secular historians have said that they narrowed that 25 million down, and he selected 400 then. So total of 400 women were selected, and basically it was almost like a Miss Persian empire contest, as far as, and they would then become the next queen. And again, in the first 2 verses, it's important that once again you see the king is kind of looking to other people to help him make up his mind of who he's going to do, and the tenants were the ones who then suggested that he have this giant beauty contest, essentially, to find his next wife or queen. In verse 5, we're introduced to Mordecai. And who is Mordecai? Okay, he's a Jew from the tribe of Benjamin, son of Jared. Yeah. So his great-grandfather would have been Kish, as far as, and that's important to stop and think about, because Kish would have been the one who was deported, and literally Mordecai grew up his entire life in exile or in Persia. And sometimes we don't think about that, as far as, so he had actually never been or known life in Jerusalem once we're introduced to him. You would think that, and it's important to know as far as, and again, one of the things I was going to bring up, which we brought up, it says that Esther was the daughter of Mordecai's uncle, which would make her cousins. So they were cousins, his cousin. And so we don't know. They don't, again, because this is just a historical narrative. It leaves out a lot of detail, like whether or not she actually wanted to be selected to go into this beauty contest, if you would. We don't really know that. It doesn't really say whether she was for it or against it, or she went voluntarily, or he persuaded her to go, or anything like that. That's actually not told. We don't know their ages, probably not as old as what we want to picture with our eyes. In fact, I read numerous historical books on it, and even that word virgin, as far as the virgins not only spoke that, in one sense, but it was a word that was used to describe very young girls also. So a lot of commentators think that this was probably younger women at that point, but we don't know as far as it doesn't say. In my mind, I always kind of think about her as like at 18, 20, but we don't know how old she was.
And I always picture Mordecai as 50 or 60.
Yeah.
Because it's an old man's name. But he could have easily been 20 or 30.
And just raised her as a...
Maybe he had an established household. She could have at that age. He would just take her in. Yes, he would have been older, but not necessarily by a decade.
It's interesting. The book is called Esther, which is her Persian name. Her Hebrew name would be Hadassah, as far as which I don't know if we even stop and think about that being her name. It's kind of like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as far as you think about it. And so, yeah, so we just remember her Persian name. And so, but he's raising and caring for her because she had lost both her father and mother. So she's an orphan. She's grown up. They've been in exile all of her life. Now, again, if you watch the movie One Night with the King, in kind of preparation for this, I thought, I'm going to go back and watch that movie. Not a great movie to watch in the sense because it's off quite a bit, but they kind of show her as far as plotting and desiring to do this, and then she goes in several times and reads to the king even before he selects her to come in for that one night. And instead of reading to him, she's supposed to be reading him to sleep, like almost like the stock market reports or whatever. But she's quoted in the story of Rachel and Leah, and so it's interesting that. But it's different there. So, and again, it shows Mordecai is older, and she's probably within her 20s. So in verse 9, it says, we see that the young woman pleased him and won his favor in taking care of Esther. And who is that talking about there?
Custodian of the women?
Yeah, the custodian of the women there, Haggai there. So he quickly provided her with cosmetics and food, and gave her 7 servants to, what's that? Choice servants, yeah. So, and as we're thinking about this and why this book is in there, as you said earlier, as far as the reason, then we can see God's hand in this, as far as this is not something that would be just happen chance, but God's sovereignty is working there, and it's evidence of God's hand that she was one of 400 that would be chosen, and one of the many millions that would be chosen. So God had a plan, and there was a purpose in this. Verse 10 is controversial with a lot of people because Esther did not make known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had instructed her that she should not make them known. And so that leaves us to the question, should we do that too? You know, are there occasions where we should withhold that we are a Christian? So that's one of the things. Again, we kind of see the providence of God. Like I said, there was a lot of discussion on whether or not, you know, are there situations in our life where we should withhold that we are Christians? And of course, some of you guys know that my oldest daughter, after she graduated from college, applied to teach English in China and was hired and spent nearly 3 years in China teaching English at the University of Hunan. Now, they were pretty much instructed once they went over there, the churches were underground, and of course they would bug her apartment, they would bug her laptop, and, you know, really watch closely what she was doing. We went to go visit for about 3 weeks, and they thought I was a minister, like a government minister, so they actually met me there, and Cindy and I got to lecture at a couple of different universities on marriage in America, which is really different now than what it was even back then. But again, we were told that we had to be very secretive as we searched out these groups, Christian groups or churches that were meeting at house churches. So there are times where we too might have to withhold our identity. And again, I think God's hand plays a key role into that. So I think one of the things it shows her wisdom in that she was willing to follow the instructions of her parent-like individual, the person who had raised her, and that it was through the years that she had obviously learned to be obedient to Mordecai. Not to get real political, but I was watching One American News or Newsmax, one or the other, on their commentator on this first debate, and it was interesting to, even at those stations, to hear the commentators saying as they evaluated Pence, their evaluation of him is that he wouldn't go very far because he was too vocal about who God was and who he was as a Christian, and that would sink his campaign. Even though I would say that's not his biggest problem, but for them, they were saying that was the problem in that. So it's kind of interesting. Those are stations that tend to be, yeah. So they had a year that they got these young women ready, and that they put them through beautification. Now, they were known, the country as far as was known for their beautification, as far as really some commentators would say they weren't even second to Egypt. But why do you suppose they would go to a whole year for this beautification? Have you ever stopped and thought about that? They had 6 months of myrrh and then 6 months of other spices. Better food. And the Hebrew word for this phrase, beauty preparation, the root comes from to scour or to polish. So no doubt, you know, part of it is they were getting just even their outer appearances differently. But another commentator, and I tend to agree with them, says another reason for this lengthy amount of time of preparation was to tell if the woman had become pregnant coming into the harem. And that would be enough time to see if there was anything going on, or that they were growing a baby that would, so that the king wouldn't be charged with fathering a child that wasn't his. And I'd never really stopped and thought about that, but if they had already conceived a child, then certainly they didn't want those to be part of that. So there were 400 women, and every one of these women would sleep with the king. When it was their turn, they'd have one night with the king. And as far as that shows the corruption or the moral corruption or ambiguity of Persia at that time period, as far as in how counter it was to what God really wanted. So it's an example that God can be faithful to us even when we're in a culture that is bankrupt or imperfect. He still will accomplish his purposes, so that's important. The women, as far as another commentator said, as for the other 399 who were not chosen, they were banished to a harem where they either stayed as a second-class wife or a concubine, but rarely, if ever, saw the king again. However, they were never free to marry another man. So essentially, they lived the rest of their life as widows from that moment on. And so sometimes that you don't think about that 399 just being totally cut off at that point. Verse 15, as far as where Esther goes in and he chooses her, we're told in verse 16 that it's the 7th reign, so that we know at this point that 4 years have passed then from the time period of chapter 1 to chapter 2, and that he had tried to invade Greece. That didn't work out, and so then he comes back and he does this whole contest. We don't know if she was number 400 or if she was number 350 or whatever, and if he stopped it at that point, we don't know. It is interesting. The commentators are mixed in when it says that that there were those coming to him the second time, as far as the virgins coming the second time, if that's kind of a summary of the whole chapter or what's happening there. The king throws a celebration and gives royal gifts and has generosity, waiving taxes, and they say that generosity was that he's probably providing a lot more rich food. You were talking about the food that they had, and so he gave food with abundance as he picked Esther. Mordecai has then a position of sitting at the gate. Why is that important for us to know at that point? It gave him access. What else does it speak to? He was wise, and he was being recognized then as almost like a judge or something, that he would sit there at the gate. And also we see God's providence there as we think about why is this book even in the Bible if it doesn't mention God's name? Because we can see that, again, Mordecai is in the right place. The providence of God has him in the right place, where then he can hear about this plot, and then he tells Esther, and Esther tells the king, and they're able to thwart this plot. I'd mentioned gallows there, as far as this is not like them hanging from the rope like we would see today, but literally that's like a crucifixion, or they were hanging from a tree is what they would say, or a spiked tree at that point. So again, kind of to sum up as far as the whole chapter, as far as we're able to see the providence of God and God working through imperfect people, though Mordecai and Esther weren't perfect, and they were living in a culture which was worse than the culture that we live in today, and yet God was able to still do his thing, and God was still in control. And I think as we face COVID and stuff like that, it's good for us to stop and remember that God is in control, and we can pray for God's protection, his presence, and his healing, even when we're going through difficult times. The other thing is that he wasn't immediately rewarded for doing the right thing. As far as, again, it was put down in the book of Chronicles, as far as, or the King's Chronicles or whatever, and noted, but the king didn't do anything at that point. And sometimes as Christians, we've got to stop and realize that, when we do the right thing, God will reward us. It may not be immediate, it may take some time. So I think that's another observation that we can make out of it.